thinking about Afterlives, the novel, it's very difficult, I think, as a novelist. It's difficult as a reader of the novel to really believe that the end has come and that you're into something after the end, because you're still reading toward the end of the novel, and the novel is going on in the usual way, and you're caught in the kind of temporality of narrative. But something that you're doing here, and you see it even in that last line, as after a while all the mothers would be, or a little bit earlier in the passage, that great section on this is how it would be with the men after they finished their work. They would have to be alone after that, and for so many years. You're invoking this sort of state that hasn't quite happened yet, but it's as though it's already occurred, and we're already in the end game. We're already sort of beyond the practical the practical endpoint. It reminds me of a phrase of Emily Wilson's from an early book of hers, which is tragic overliving, this sort of sense of having lived beyond the moment of the proper completion or finish of something, which that something in your case is the world, right, or human life. So I'm not sure I really have a question here, but I feel like that this problem of how to invoke the end and its beyond, while the action of the fiction is still going on, is a kind of compositional problem that you are wrestling with in your novels, more not just here. So.
No, that is true. I mean, I really like that tragic overliving turn of phrase, by the way. I think that's great. And there are, even in that book, I think there's the mother of the main character has certainly tragically overlived, is in the midst of tragically overliving. It's sort of that,
Yes.
where the moment where you've lost yourself and you're no longer yourself. And of course, this happens more and more as we sort of becoming an aging population, and we live in a sense too long for our own good often, and begin to not be ourselves. And so I think there is, well, in the case of certain demographics, among the humans, there's tragic overliving occurring, and of course tragic underliving for many others. but that's the normal sort of tragedy that we're used to. What was the question?
T's mother has an after-death or near-death experience, right? She sort of dies, and then she comes back, and she says it was very disappointing. The afterlife was not what I expected. It was the International House of Pancakes. She says, I thought it would be more expensive. And that's a sort of running joke about the afterlife, the IHOP joke through the novel. But
she was really disappointed in her gentility that she had been demoted to this IHOP situation. When she returned. Yeah.
I want to stick with, I think she's Angela, right?
Yeah.
She comes up, and I'm going to jump to the end of the trilogy. I picked up Magnificence, which I read a couple of times in the past 2 weeks, and unlike Jim, my favorite passage is actually the end of the trilogy, the last kind of pieces of Magnificence. In Magnificence, Susan has taken up residence in a mansion, and she's not quite sure where the uncle's fortune has come from that has built this house, as it is this huge house that she's unexpectedly moved into. T's mom also unexpectedly moves into Angela, has another afterlife. This one isn't the IHOP, it's part of this mansion, and she moves in and she brings all of her friends. And it's just this incredibly kind of funny and unexpected turn. One of the other unexpected turns in this mansion is that it turns out to be built kind of literally on extinction. That in the basement are these drawers and drawers of extinct animals, the Holocene extinctions, 1800 to 2000. It hasn't, we know it's not yet 2000. It hasn't yet happened. The uncle has died before we've reached 2000. And I wanted to ask you again about this. The apocalypse has already happened. We know it's already, there's this sort of, we're living on. We've tragically overlived. But Susan meets this with a very different kind of affect. And I wanted to just read just the last lines where she says to her lover, "Stay with me, Jim. There's still some time. We'll keep each other company, stay in these rooms for years and years, live on forever in a glorious museum." And I just wanted to ask you about, on the one hand, the passage that you read wasn't funny, and this isn't funny either, but it's not exactly, it's a different kind of grief. It's like it's like an elegy. And I just wanted to ask you about the emotional burden of some of that writing that you do.
Okay, so that's a complicated. I don't even know whether that's an assertion or a question or whatever. Although I appreciate you liking that passage. I essentially, I write every book for that last passage, and so I'm pleased that you both have liked the last passage. But every book I write so that I can have that feeling at the end that people have written about before. But even as I write it, of simultaneous joy and sadness, I always want to, if sadness is not sort of aesthetically compelling, then really it's just depression or something. I don't know. Like I want always to have like the joy and the sadness, because it's only with some degree of beauty of language or some sort of notion of sublimeness or something that you can, at least for me in text, experience the kind of sadness that you might listening to music. So that is that what prose has to do, or poetry that's good, it actually has to, it has to be, there's no way to sadness without some sort of beauty in sentences here, because we don't have the grace of music that just sort of flicks our brains into that sort of quiet, tragic state of appreciation of time sort of passing and all that. So I always am writing toward that, whatever sensation that is at the end of a book, in both these books. And this trilogy was about, it was about last things. It was about last creatures, and the experience that we have watching last creatures go. I think it was last week, the last, white rhino, Sudan died, male northern white rhino. So that really is a new extinction. And we've recently coined a term that we never even used to have, right, for the last creature of its kind in a species, right? So, which is endling, and we never needed to have that word until recently, and now we have a word for the last creature of its kind. So they're endlings, and we meet sort of new endlings in the news fairly often. So it's a time where we're seeing this. We've seen this sort of great acceleration, and now we're seeing this great capitulation, this great sort of falling away of that which exists, the diversity of existence, and we have to live with that. And so our experience, I think, is unprecedented in a way. I mean, we've evolved. We had never have lived without this diversity of creatures that. We've evolved, we've co-evolved. We've lived side by side with everything in the world almost everything that we now know. And all of a sudden it's falling away, and we will be in a place we've never known. Our species has never known. And I'm kind of interested in this idea of species aloneness and what will our experience be when there aren't as many others in the world.
But if that, Lydia, is the experience that you're evoking in these final passages in these novels, and especially in the trilogy, it sounds very pessimistic, and yet you devote yourself in your day job, right, to resisting exactly these tendencies and to sustaining the diversity, the biological diversity around us. And so, we wanted to talk to you about double lives as well as afterlives. There's a French sociologist named Bernard Lier who wrote a book called The Double Life of the Writer that I kind of like, The Double Life of the Writer. And he starts by saying how people in the literary world think of writers as just sort of writers. And so it's like their entire existence is about being a writer. But he does this sociological study of thousands of writers, and pretty much all of them have like full-time jobs doing other things, and not just jobs, but other things. And they're only writers like a little bit at a time. So he talks about this doubleness of the writer. Well, in your case, like someone reads your bio or knows even a little bit about you, it seems like you really are leading a double life as a writer, and yet there's a kind of integration there. Mm-hmm. Can you describe that, and whether you see the novels as amplifying or supplementing or completing, or how they relate to the work that you do at the Center for Biological Diversity?
First of all, when you earlier in an email mentioned Bernard Lahire or Bernard Lahire, or however you want me to say its name, I was cursing you for not having picked someone who's like on Wikipedia in English, because like, I couldn't,
He's not widely known.
Yeah, no, it's like no Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
Damn it. But yeah, so I work almost full time, like 30 hours a week for this conservation group that's fairly litigious. We're pretty aggressive. We're not sort of a compromising. We do negotiate, and there are plenty of legal settlements and stuff, but we're not an accommodationist group. So we litigate pretty hard against the government, sometimes corporations, but mostly the government, to get them to uphold environmental law, very often the Endangered Species Act. And so we do a lot of species preservation work. We get a lot of habitat protected, which is really the best way to save species oftentimes, is just to protect where they live. Under US law anyway. And we also do a lot of climate change work, so some pretty big lawsuits on climate and Clean Air Act stuff. And so that's what we do. And my work is, I wanted to say, like, I wish I could describe myself as a scientist. It's not quite honest to say that. I work with scientists and lawyers, but most of what I do have like a graduate degree in vaguely scientific, environmental management or whatever. But really what I do is just try to translate their work for people who aren't scientists and lawyers. So that's sort of what I do. I'm surrounded by scientists, but I wish I could call myself one, but I can't. But the work that I do, there's really sort of no mental war between that work that I do and my books. There's only sort of a time war, because I don't have often enough time to do my own prose in the course of a day. But mostly I'm writing and editing there, and I feel like I have to do that work, particularly because I'm actually not pessimistic. I'm actually not a pessimist. I try to look at the facts, I try to look at the science, and I'm actually just highly idealistic and hopeful and optimistic, and I just love the world. I love the animals in it, and I think most people do. I think people love the wild world, and they love animals, and all their lives they're trained to love animals, and they really, really do. It's just that we forget that as we grow older sometimes. We forget how dear other animals were to us when we were children, and how our whole language is defined by animals. We can't even have metaphor. We can't even have it without animals. Everything we are is really has been shaped by all these other non-human people that we evolved around and grew up around, even on an individual level. And people really want for extinction not to happen. And it's all about structures, of political structures and power, and also the way we live, the way we use oil and gas and other resources and stuff. All those things are clearly driving extinction, but extinction is not what people want. And as long as people love animals, and I think that they do just at their core, there will always be this fight that can sometimes be won against extinction. So I'm not at all like throwing up my hands, but I'm saying there is, in my work and also in my day job, there has to be a practical side to all this. For me, I can't just write books about, there's no instant gratification in literary fiction, really. And I like instant gratification. I'm, American. And so I have to, I have to have a job where I can see some sort of immediate impact from the time that I put in, and on these matters that are so time sensitive. There's really, we need to act on things like climate and extinction immediately. There's not really a margin for error, unfortunately. in these things, in these problems. And so, yeah, I do feel like I need myself to have like a daily return on some of that stuff where I can, even if it's just, you know, correcting the grammar of a lawyer who's like suing on behalf of elephants, you know?
Yeah.
It's something, you know?
I have to say, I've taken like great, I've felt a lot of inspiration by looking at the center's work and also the litigious work, which I think is really important. I've been really impressed particularly by the campaign against the border walls and making sure that animals can move back and forth in an unrestricted way, which brings me to a question of a border wall builder who is definitely in Wikipedia, and that's our current president. He actually, there's a character that runs throughout this trilogy that at one point is directly compared to maybe Donald Trump or maybe Leona Helmsley, right? And it was so funny to read it again, you know, like years later, like coming back to it now in this moment of this Trumpian presidency. What's really interesting about that character to me is that he has this incredible double life where he has a second life, where he has this conversion, right? He loves animals suddenly. He gives everything up. He's, you know, this in the whole second novel in the trilogy of Ghost Lights, he's missing. Everyone is looking for him. Hal Lindley gets sent down to this sort of unknown place looking for him. And then he's off in the third one and out saving the animals. And I wondered, like, how do you draw a character who is, in the first part of his life, Donald Trump, and the second part of his life is basically a conservation biologist or a conservationist at any rate.
Well, I mean, the story of him, actually the character's name is T, just the initial T. But this was like long before I'd actually really even heard of Donald Trump that I wrote these books. But it is T. It actually stood for Thomas in the books, but sort of doubting Thomas was what I was thinking of. But yeah, he just has this, well, actually, his connection is through this coyote that he hits that I made reference to in that passage, and this dog that he adopts. Like that's sort of that's his inroad into the world of other animals that are disappearing, and he starts breaking into zoos, which is not, you know, recommended for conservationists, by the way. But he sort of wants to. He just sort of has this sort of break. His girlfriend dies also, and he's. You know, he's grief-stricken, and so he starts wanting to be near. He decides he wants to be near these last animals, these endlings. But they're not always literal endlings, but they're sort of individuals of species that are very rare and dying off. And so he starts breaking into zoo enclosures and just to be near them. It's this odd conversion where he just doesn't. He's always been like this capitalist who, when he was a little boy, held coins in his mouth. Which actually got
sleeps with his money under his pillow.
Yeah. So that was based on my brother actually, who's an entrepreneur now, and who went to Penn, by the way. But yeah, so yeah, he sort of. I often do have even though I'm loath to follow the sort of path to enlightenment character arc that is traditionally sort of advocated, I do often have characters who undergo these spectacular conversions. Because it's real to me. It's real to me, actually, to feel that I have felt sort of moments of revelation in my life. I think it's a genuine experience, and I think that time can really change you. Time can change you, and so to me, it was never actually a stretch, even though, yeah, some of these characters really go from. And then I have other characters like the pornographer and Everyone's Pretty, who really doesn't change a whit. I mean, because there's just like this. Or
Ned.
Or Ned, yeah, right. Some of the.
Just to come back on the double life thing again, because like T, for a while at least, T, yes, he has a conversion, but he's still a real estate entrepreneur full-time during the day, making a lot of money. And then he has this sort of secret life at night where he's sneaking into zoos and he's got all this research going on animals, but nobody knows about that at work. During the day, he's doing this one thing. And his wife also sort of has like this secret life as a slut or whatever it is, right? And his daughter has a secret life doing phone sex. And so it does seem like there's, in your novels, there's a tendency for these characters to lead kind of double lives, to be two things, not one. Mm-hmm. You think that's right, or?
I mean, in reality, we're all probably far more complex than just, bifurcated. In reality, we're sort of like, we probably have 8 lives or something, or 9 like a cat or something. We're chameleons, and we show, different sides to different people, and we're different in our home life from how we are in our work life. And it is sort of boring. I do get bored, like when there's a really obvious double life thing, like on a TV show where someone's like a hitman by night and like a surgeon by day or whatever. It's a bit hackneyed, some of that. But I think there are ways to. Maybe it's a proxy, it's a stand-in for the more subtle kind of private lives or multifaceted lives that we actually have. And so much of ourselves exists in a space where we wouldn't want anyone else to see it. Even those of us who are honest or aspire to be honest, we really are full of secrets. And sometimes our secrets protect other people, actually. Yeah. And sometimes they just protect ourselves. But
I want to ask about not the Damascus Road conversion religiosity, but the Sweet Lamb of Heaven, which comes after the trilogy, but I felt like it shares a lot of sort of similar concerns, religious as well, obviously. But one of the things that I'm really have been thinking about a lot is the way that the narrator of Sweet Lamb, she doesn't so much have a double life as she's sort of plugged into this language that is reverberating in her head for certain times. And she doesn't know for a while what she's hearing, and she eventually figures out it's her infant daughter who's still in a pre-verbal stage. And then when the daughter begins to speak, the language sort of shuts down. But then she connects into this whole group of people who are somehow plugged into this hum or vibration, and they're kind of tuning in to these voices from all around. How do you, that seems less obviously Christian, and then also sort of deeply it's like the life force that they're somehow plugged into. Mm-hmm. And in order to defend it, the mom in the story actually eventually literally has to murder the guy who would exterminate that.
What a spoiler. No,
I know,
I'm
so sorry. I actually meant to say, spoiler alert. It's such a good book.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So with that book specifically, I was just interested in the fact that in this culture, in this country particularly, there seems to be this sort of culture war where science and God are seen to be mutually exclusive or antithetical to each other or something. And we all know that, neither science nor religion is actually that simplistic, but there is still this culture war where science is the enemy, and it has real implications for our politics and for the physical world. It's actually a really important misunderstanding in culture, right? So it's a problem, that this sort of schism. And so I sort of wanted to make a story where there was an idea of God that wasn't antithetical to science, that wasn't hostile to science at all, and sort of, it's actually very much an idea book, except that it's in the guise of a thriller, but it's really about the idea that we might define God just as language. Language might be God, that which is beyond our understanding, such as the way we create language. We really don't understand our own language, or despite Chomsky, we don't understand the way that our humanity intersects with our ability to have this complex and sophisticated language. And yet we do believe it's crucial to our humanity. But maybe there's a way to just think of all of that as a form of God, God as a form of language, or language as a form of God. And so that's sort of what I was doing in there. I don't know if did I say anything to your actual?
Yeah, totally. One of the things I think that you helped me think through is also that the dichotomy or the kind of struggle in this book. I suppose in some ways it's capitalism versus science/religion. It's sort of life against capitalism, in a way.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting. It seems incredibly prescient to me, the way that it's written, and I don't know. I don't have a question there, other than it just seems marvelously anticipatory of concerns that we're faced with in a much more sort of startling way, only 4
And
years
if
later.
you
Right.
if you haven't read Sweet Lamb of Heaven, it's not really spoilable because it's got so many unexpected
Turns, yeah.
features, and it is a mashup of thriller and
Horror, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you into those genres? Do you like Rosemary's Baby and Ira Levin?
I like
and
Rosemary's Baby.
I think
yeah.
there's an
I wish I
exorcist.
could
There's
see
an
them there.
exorcist. There's an
Yeah, no, it
exorcist reference.
definitely, yeah. I actually was always really into those, even though I was brought up in a pretty secular home, but I always liked and was just completely horrified by movies where the devil is involved. And, this sort of Christian-based horror movie. The horror movies, sort of, not slasher movies, but a lot of horror movies in sort of the Hollywood canon are really sunk into Christianity. The myths of Christianity are what enable those stories to even exist, right? So I just remember liking a bunch of, and also apocalyptic sort of, what was that Demi Moore one, like the Seventh Seal, not Seventh Sign, one or the other. Anyway, it's sort of like,
Seventh Sense, no.
it's all about the book of Revelation, and she has to finally sacrifice herself as a mother, so that the devil doesn't. Yeah. Anyway, I really like those kinds of horror, kind of horror tropes are interesting to me. Probably even more than sort of a thriller structure. I was more interested in horror for this book. So it does have, but it only has a few scenes of horror actually. Just that there's one near the end, and but yeah, I do like that stuff. I think more from a movie than a book perspective. I've certainly seen a lot more horror movies than I've read horror books. Although I did read Rosemary's Baby and Stephen King when I was growing up.
Ira Levin's he's a very good writer, I think,
Yeah.
of that genre. He expressed misgivings late in life about because Rosemary's Baby is like the mid-'60s, and he felt that he was at least in part responsible for all of that Christian, God versus devil and the sort of satanic narratives that then become really commonplace all through the 70s, and that had driven the fundamentalist turn in American society. He said, I wish I hadn't written it.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's interesting, that the idea that might have driven fundamentalism. I never thought of it that way.
But you're a very difficult writer to classify, in terms of these different genres. And if I had to say, if someone says, so what kind of writer is Lydia Millet? I would probably say a political satirist. Like that would be the shorthand. Political novels, hilariously funny. But then there's all this other stuff in there that's harder to describe. We were wondering, Bethany and I talking about your work, what you think the novel is capable of doing, kind of as a technology of political communication these days. You're very committed to the novel. You've written 8 novels? And a couple of
13,
books of stories.
12,
yeah,
11, I don't know.
A lot, and they're great. But the novel is a form that's been around for a long time, and it has some, limitations. And so, how do you relate to the novel as a form, and why does it seem to you the thing that you should be doing?
Well, I guess for me personally, it's the thing I can do. I don't know how many of you are driven to do your work just because it's the thing you can do best, but for me, that's sort of what it was. But I think you brought up that, how do you pronounce his name? Is it Amitav Ghosh or Ghosh? Or how do you pronounce his name?
Yeah,
Ghosh. Yeah, I see it written, but since I'm not an academic, I never hear it said. Yeah. But his complaint that that the novel hasn't sufficiently confronted the matter of climate change and stuff, I think it's true, but it's also sort of like a sad joke to sort of accuse the literary fiction of not having. Sort of like, this problem that all the governments and corporations of the world have failed to grapple with to anyone's satisfaction, and it should be addressed effectively by literary fiction. It's hilarious. So you can't really expect this genre to have come to terms so quick. Even stuff like the nuclear threat, nuclear anxiety, which I think still is worthy of being written about.
got a
But
book
that, yeah, I mean, I do, but even now, like now, that's never really been sufficiently grappled with either. I mean, of course, there's a lot of art and film and stuff like that tries to sort of embrace the full horror, I guess, of the nuclear threat. But none of it really can embody that on the scale that's really required to sort of even Dr. Strangelove, which I loved, fails to do that adequately, except for the credit sequence, which is a triumph. But it's really hard to write about unprecedented subjects and culture. So the nuclear threat really was unprecedented. Climate change is without precedent in terms of the scale. It's human scale, and not only human, but it's global and planetary scale. And I think we've only had a couple decades to really even begin to sort of existentially absorb some of this stuff. That said, I think Ghosh or whatever, he really has a point that, I mean, of course we should write about it and we should try to, but it's a really tough, it's a difficult task. Yeah. It's a tough one, and sort of the scale of it and the abstraction, and it's worth doing, but I don't think there are a lot of storytellers who are comfortable with it even just maybe for the reason that you're trying to tell a personal narrative about this massive revolutionary paradigm shifting. It's a tall order. I did just finish a book that wants to address that wants to be about the sort of climate change, but critics may hate it. I don't know. It's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, it is. I mean, one of the things that Ghosh says, the sort of the basic critique in that section of his book, which is called The Great Derangement, is that in part the politics of climate change are a failure of imagination, and I think for that reason he kind of lays particular blame on cultural producers, and yet at the same time it's such a massive problem. How do you construct a character or a family, which is after all the very stuff of the realist novel? And while you do depart from the realist novel with sort of horror kind of genres at times, or other types of genre fiction, at heart this is a realist novel, and yet, I mean, they all are, and yet effective, I think, with characters who really are, like T, experiencing these sudden shifts and changes. And there's a number of these like shifts and changes that happen to these characters. I already mentioned that Susan unexpectedly inherits the mansion and moves in, and T's mom moves in with her, or Casey has the tragic accident and ends up in a wheelchair. I want to come back to the animals who seem to motivate this over and over again. And I'm going to use those animals to get to a different kind of writing that you do, which is also this op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times, which is about this: what will our children's imaginations be like when the great animals are gone? It's been interesting to me. I teach that op-ed piece sometimes to my students, and it affects them in a way that the realist novel does not. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously a shorter piece of writing, and it packs a real punch, and it has an urgency that it's hard for me to teach because I always cry. These I don't, like they're funny. I was telling Jim I was reading them next to the pool in Southern California, which was great because they're set in Southern California, and I was like laughing, and everyone was like, who's this crazy woman laughing? But they really are funny. So I'm just curious about, is the realist novel capable of that urgency that you're suggesting really is necessary, or do you find yourself also wanting to turn to these other types of writing that pack a much more immediate impact?
Well, I really think we just sort of need everything. It should be sort of like a no-holds-barred sort of multidisciplinary approach to communication on climate change. I really do think that just because of the time scales we're dealing with and what sort of the science has to say, and it's not clear whether we still can, avert the worst effects of this, but we should try. We should try in every way that we know. And so I do think it's kind of, it's perfect in a way for writers to claim, or a writer to claim, that it's really the fault of writers that we don't have the political will to like tackle the greatest crisis that humanity's ever faced. Yeah, it must be us, the writers. It must be us, man. We just haven't done our job. It's insane. Like, we are the least powerful people in the world. You know, it's hilarious. But yes, I do, that particular op-ed was one that was close to my heart too. A lot of the op-eds that I wrote for the Times were just really issue specific and just saying this should happen in Washington or this should not happen, and or illuminating what's going on legally with grizzlies or wolves or whatever. That particular one I just really wrote from the heart about, because I really believe that children are formed, as I mentioned earlier. Children's whole sort of soul, children's souls are formed through animals, and there's just we don't even know a different way of bringing up children than by showing them animal forms and playing them animal sounds and putting animals on their clothing, and their alphabets are made of animals, and all their toys are animals, and their games and their books have animals, are the main characters, and I don't think we know a different way of bringing up our children yet. It hurts my feelings to think of a world where there's no elephants. That elephants are just a figment of they're just something in the past like dinosaurs. And it breaks my heart to think of that. And so that particular op-ed that I wrote I write from the heart. I wrote from the heart very much. I do think the thing about animals and what makes them hard to write about is the fact that, they don't talk, partly, right? So we have this language barrier, with animals. And yet I think that very barrier is what makes them so captivating and so excellent and wonderful. I think the thing about animals, or one of the things, is that they're unknowable. Their subjectivity, their mental lives, their emotional lives are actually, even our pets, unknowable to us because we don't have this language thing with them. They're unknowable, and their unknowability is what we should retain. We need creatures in the world that we can't understand. We need otherness, to be worthy of ourselves. If we don't have something that really, many things that are other that we don't understand, really life wouldn't be worth living. It's as though, it would be like living in these bright lights all the time, say, or the lights of a diner or something like that, and having no dark forests out there, having no deep oceans, having no night sky. We have to have that we don't know and can't understand. And if we lose these others that are animals.
That's what I love about that passage that you read for us from How the Dead Dream, is that this wild beast that is like on top of T's arm, he's trying to sleep. He doesn't know what kind of animal it is. He has no knowledge of what this is, except it's just another mammal that's there with him, and he's sort of stuck with it. And and yet there's a relationship there that's very powerful and it's strong enough to sort of carry the burden of the whole novel. But it's not cute. And it reminds me of another essay, short essay that you wrote a long time ago about the problem with environmentalist photography. That there's this tendency toward the big-eyed, cute animal, sort of looking back at the camera like a family snapshot or something, like a baby, or even the landscape photography, you say, is like it's so pretty, and there's this soft aesthetic, of kind of easy cuteness or attachment that is not strong enough, right, for environmentalist politics. And we need a rhetoric that's stronger than that, maybe uglier than that. I feel like your novels are trying to find this other aesthetic that's rougher edged than what we might be expecting from kind of cli-fi.
Right, and I don't actually, I think another problem traditionally with environmentalism has been a certain humorlessness. And that doesn't mean that all environmentalists are humorless, but really the sort of trappings of the movement are
high earnestness.
Somewhat, just earnest, yeah. And that's a problem for us, because there always has to be, I think we need humor to be able to fully inhabit something.
I think one of the funniest pieces that I found in Sweet Lamb is there's a moment when the evil dad gives the daughter a stuffed animal, which is that big-eyed, fuzzy animal, and she's this incredibly like open and receptive kid, and really has this amazing joy and sense of well-being in the world. And she starts figuring out that this present and the person who it came from is fairly malevolent. And her response, and I found this was like so canny and yet incredibly funny at the same time, was she later tells him that she doesn't bring the stuffed animal along because it's gotten ill. And then she tells him it has cancer. It's like this incredibly funny like, little kid plot, but it's like she's already really figured out the way that she's being manipulated and how she can manipulate back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's pretty smart.
So we actually got, or I got a lamb like that from my ex-mother-in-law. Well, my daughter did when she was really little, and it was a really creepy lamb that said the same things. It was battery powered, and said the same thing that had the Lord's, not the Lord's Prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and it would say this in this little. It's completely horrifying. It was really horror show. Yeah. So we had to take the batteries out, just as she does in the book.
Anyone who knows the horror genre knows that those talking stuffed animals are really evil.
That's a no-no.
Scary.
That's a no-no.
You do
Yeah,
not want
no.
those in the bedroom with you.
No, avoid with prejudice, for sure.
Should we open up to questions from the audience? We have, are we passing a microphone? Sierra Lamuto, our research fellow, will bring a mic to you up there and back. Sierra. We're not picking you up on the microphone. Can you?
It's not doing
It may be the mic. It came on for a second. It's on? Try pointing it right at your mouth. Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so anyway, so I thought that as a society we're very fascinated with the whole thing of duality, as you mentioned, in terms of the hitman versus the surgeon by day. And I think that whole multifaceted situation, like almost like in a way like schizophrenia, is very fascinating to us. So I just thought, so my question was, what made you specifically be interested in terms of describing that particular genre? Because I think we're all very fascinated, we're complex creatures in general, and why not think about it in terms of a few more personalities? Do you understand the question?
I'm not sure. Not sure if I do. You mean why did I
go from like surgeon to hitman? Because those are like two extreme levels, and why not like do like a progressive, series?
Well, so in my books, it's not so much a surgeon-hitman situation, but the character T certainly is almost that extreme of a contrast, I guess, because he's this, real estate guy, but then he's really concerned with, and his real estate development actually, one of them actually drives, this little critter to the brink of extinction and stuff, so he's directly involved in that enterprise of extinction, and then he becomes this sort of, radicalized, I guess, or something, by personal loss, and so there is actually, it's not always that he's simultaneously two things. It's that, it's that he's sort of traumatized by something that happens, and he kind of goes in a new direction and stuff like that. But does that answer what you're? I'm not sure.
Do you feel like the whole thing of duality is based more on environment, or is it something like you could be, you could have many personalities in the same environment? Is what I was sort of alluding to. So do you think that being in different environments allows us to kind of like, actually zone in on that versus being in the same environment? Well,
I definitely think that we're code switchers and we're chameleons, and you know, if we're lucky, we adapt to different environments that we move through because we have to, you know. And I think some of us are less adaptable than others. And actually, that can be very appealing when people are less adaptable too, because it can seem like their self is stronger. And then also, you know, moving into different environments as real people. I'm talking not about fictional characters, but just as real people. There's a way in which the more chameleon-like we are, the less we can be trusted, sort of. So you sort of like to see someone who doesn't, whose self seems to be unwavering sometimes. But I guess, yeah, in terms of the characters that I write, I mean, they're not all double lifers or anything like that. And they're not really Jekyll Hyde characters, really. There's a lot of sort of personality consistency to them. But yeah, in that particular book, he's probably the most extreme example of a double life that I can think of, T. Yeah.
Yeah, but Hal is totally, I feel like, totally consistent. We were talking about this earlier today. Like, Hal has
IRA man.
IRA guy whose idea of a rebellion is
IRS.
IRS.
That would be so different.
Yeah, not an IRA.
That'd be such a different
IRA. Definitely IRS. You know, like he has, you know, 2 whiskeys, and that's his great rebellion.
Right. I
He's
really relate
pretty,
to Hal.
me
I
too.
identify with
He's
him
awesome.
a lot. Yeah.
He's steady Eddie.
No.
And then my last question.
Well, let's let somebody else here. Yes.
Thanks so
Sarah.
much. I have a question about the ambition and the fortitude that it takes to write a trilogy. So I'm thinking, you know, when I think about novels that are in trilogies or in series, I either think of fantasy like Tolkien and Rowling, and it's so much world that has to be described, or I think of like Knausgaard, and there's just so much ego that has to be written, right? And I was wondering, I guess the academic version of the question is back to the scale point that you mentioned when you were talking about Ghosh. Is there something about the issue that interests you of species death, of climate, where you felt like you had to write a novel in multiple parts? And the less academic version of that question is just like how and why you do that.
Well, you know, I like short books, first of all. So that's the non-academic answer to your question. I like short books. Even those aren't even as short as they could be. I mean, I could write even shorter books. I'm going to write shorter books in the future, short as possible. But I really did want to stay in the same world, but I rotated through sort of 3 different points of view in the 3 books, so I didn't, because I have a short attention span sometimes, and when I started that trilogy, I had young children, and I really didn't want to write this big doorstop of a book, because I don't like reading them, actually. I really don't. I find them, they should be edited most times. They've been really poorly edited, and they could be like a quarter of the length and still, and better, actually better, like stronger, more coherent and unified and stuff. And so I didn't want a long thing, but I did want to stay in the same world. And so, I sort of just accomplished that for myself by skipping from one person's point of view to another's, and they were fairly different characters, all 3 of them. But I like to stay in the same world because it's almost like it's a shorthand in a way where you don't have to. I mean, hopefully the books can be read on their own. But it is sort of a nice shorthand when you can refer to this pre-existing context. And yeah, so I guess it was lazy, a combination of lazy and impatient. Is that okay?
Yeah. Anyone else? Paul?
Thank you for this great dialogue. You mentioned this moment about animals not having language, and it took me to an experience that I had the first time I had a dog, which was as an adult, and I had this feeling like my dog always wanted to say something to me, and I would just, like, in some ways with his presence and his movements, and you know, my partner always say, like, I think he's just saying he's hungry, or something like that. I was thinking about that kind of like desire to hear words from this other sentient being, this animal, and then the act as a writer of giving an animal a story or providing a story for them, and how you balance that in the power of the unknowability of what an animal is thinking with the incorporation of narrative or story
Well, there are some writers who write from the point of view of, like Barbara Gowdy with the elephant book. Was it the White Bone or the White? Not the Carry Home one, but the. Anyway, so there's obviously some examples of writers who write sort of from the point of view of animals, and some of them kind of occasionally pull it off. I think it's not something I'm really comfortable with, actually, writing from the point of view of animals. It seems, I mean, it's a great enterprise if people want to undertake it. I'm just not, I don't know. Whenever I have, I don't even know if I've tried exactly to do that. I just prefer to keep the animals sort of unadulterated, and because what I'm interested in is not how we might invest them with our own. First of all, I'm really interested in voice, and it's difficult to imagine sort of investing any kind of animal with the sort of voices that I write, and there's something ugly about it. It'd be like putting, I don't know, a really unfortunate garment on a parrot or something. It just
You wouldn't want that animal for a pet.
Yeah, you wouldn't, and you wouldn't wish it upon them, sort of. That's not to say it's not worth trying, and I think some people really have done really sort of brave things with that. But for me, I'm interested more in the way that we imagine animals, and the way sort of the space between us and animals, and what we sort of infer, what we sort of put into that space that is made up by us. And I want the animals to exist for their own intrinsic, in their own lives and stuff like that. But the way I write about them has more to do with the way we bounce ourselves off them, if that makes any sense. And so, yeah, it would be, in my personal work, it would be presumptuous for me to make my animals talk. But that doesn't mean there can't be a story built around them. Of course, I don't know if I'm really answering what you said. Okay.
Do you own a dog? Are you a dog?
I have a pug dog, so yes and no.
Okay. Bethany,
And some fish. Yeah.
Someone else? Emily?
So this is a question about the apocalypse. But I was struck early on in your kind of riff on the great acceleration becoming the great capitulation, and not things falling apart, but things falling away. But all of your verb tenses were about ongoingness, not about break. And so I've been reading, for some reason, a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, which is so interested in breaks. But it struck me that little riff that you did, and then also the piece that you read from the novel, was really about the long sort of now before the break, as opposed to post-apocalypse.
Yeah.
Kind of long, prolonged moment before then, and that's what the novel could actually come to terms with, as opposed to describing life post-apocalypse, or narrating, continuing a narration that would be impossible after the actual apocalypse. So I wondered if you, I don't know, if that kind of temporal prolongation was part of the fiction that you read today, or if that's sort of something you think the novel could be capable of articulating contra gauche and his sort of.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I can't remember where it was recently, but I read someone writing about me and other writers as pre-apocalyptic or something somewhere, and I thought that was kind of an interesting way to describe it, the pre-apocalyptic. So I think there's so much post-apocalyptic work across multiple genres, and really I like some of it. I've liked a lot of science fiction that sort of is situated in that realm, but I also find there's something sort of boring about it to me, and honestly, if I one guy with guns and a weird tank thing, if I see one more in a burnt out landscape, honestly, I couldn't be more bored. I just really, so I'm not really interested. Although when I was in college, I wrote a short story that featured a mother and daughter in a post-apocalyptic scenario that were actually hunting giant cockroaches with spears. So I have tried that approach. Did not succeed. But I am interested because this is the space we live in, and also because I have this sort of, even though it's hard to do and you don't want to be polemic and stuff like that, I do have this sort of, what should I call it, advocacy part of my work. This part where I want to, there's some sort of spirit of prayer or elegy, half prayer, half elegy, half exhortation, or if that's too many halves, but okay, third exhortation or something. I want to have this part of my books that contains this sort of forward motion, this sort of this notion that there's a space we can inject ourselves into around the future and how to shape it. And so for me, it would be sort of useless to situate my books in the after the apocalypse because I'm interested in how we can exist now and how these kinds of stories can inform how we exist now. So
Isn't the YA novel Pills and Starship
Yes,
sort of
it is.
post-apocalyptic?
Yeah, that's the closest I've ever come, and it's also but it still has this idea of saving creatures from extinction in it.
Yeah,
and
still
and it's
stuff
set in
going on.
Hawaii, so how bad can that be, right? Like,
But I actually, I took our title for the event is, of course, it's a post-apocalyptic novel, but I took it to mean actually that we were saying that one of the ways to understand your work is that the apocalypse is not a useful way of understanding what's happening to us, that it's a very long event, like it's the 200-year, the Great Holocene extinction, as
No, I think it's not. Unfortunately, the problem with the apocalypse is it doesn't sort of manifest as a bunch of angels in the Whore of Babylon and stuff like that. It is sort of
or even the guy on the motorcycle. With all
or the guy on the motorcycle with the
Not that photogenic.
Yeah. And so we can be in the grips of something, and people are already suffering enormously from climate change, and we sort of constantly seem to be insisting that it's just around the corner, it's sort of on the horizon. But it's really not. It's happening. It's already happening. And anyone who knows the science knows that it's already happening. And so there's that reason. But also, apocalypse, I think, is so sexy, like the idea of it. Everyone knows, it comes from ancient Greek word it means revelation, that which is revealed, right? So that sounds kind of good. Like, that's awesome, right? Like, let it be revealed that I am saved, and you are not, by the way, among other things that might be revealed. So it is sort of, it's kind of a sexy way of dealing with the end of time or the end of the familiar world, the known world, or our sort of extermination of, other living things. So yeah, apocalypse, it just does have a sort of hackneyed quality to it. I think it's a shorthand for us to say we're thinking about end times, we're thinking about transformation, we're thinking about culture being radically changed in a short time frame over the course of a couple generations. It's just shorthand for all that, and but I do like pre-apocalyptic sort of,
Yeah, you wanted to get another question in back there, yeah.
So I agree with you. I was going to say, that's very interesting to me too, because you actually alluded to the seventh son, I think is what you were talking about, in terms
Right.
of that whole apocalyptic thing. For me, I was more into Legion, because I actually found that more fascinating in terms of the angel, the angel warfare, and actually try to, because I really didn't understand.
Is that the Denzel Washington one? Where the spirit of the devil goes into his mouth, which is something.
Like
Okay.
I think that's what it was. But anyhow, it was something very interesting. So that's why I was like trying to see why you would choose the seventh son versus Legion in terms of your.
I think just because Legion's pretty recent, and I was thinking back to like my teenagehood, and that's when that came out. That was like an '80s kind of a.
Fighting the devil in a way, and then you really have to be like very well versed in terms of the biblical revelation, the horsemen and all that.
We don't really have to be because they tell you very carefully in the script. So
They fill in.
yeah, they fill in all the blanks for you. Yeah.
And my last question would be about tea. Is there, like, in terms of tea, you compare tea to a coyote in one of your novels. Do you see any other films like that sort of resemble tea or similar to tea?
Yours is
good
under
question.
contract, right, for a film in the making?
That was sort of, but I don't think anything's going to happen with that one. But the Mermaids one is under contract, and the Sweet Lamb of Heaven one, are option. But in terms of like, you mean the character and his story, that being sort of also, so
Cinematic.
I don't know. Can you guys think of any story that's like that? There probably is some analog somewhere.
Damascus Road?
3There's nothing new under the sun and all that. Yeah, I don't know.
Nothing jumps into my mind.
I don't know.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer though.
Anyone else? Shall we thank Lydia Millet for, sorry, well, too soon. If you do,